You gave all your money to a stranger, Sarah. This ranch doesn't run on kindness, her parents' words echoed in her head, but Sarah Miller didn't flinch. She gave her last $2,000 to a veteran she barely knew because his baby was sick and he was about to lose everything. She thought she was sacrificing her ranch just to help someone stay in their home. The next morning, the barn was empty, the horses were hungry, and she was ready to say goodbye. Then 3 military trucks pulled into her driveway and the man she helped stepped out in uniform. He wasn't just a veteran, he was part of something far bigger. Stay tuned to uncover this incredible twist. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Maggie Harper had owned the Bluebell Diner in rural East Texas for over 20 years. She'd seen hard years and harder people, but she'd also seen miracles, though they never came easy. Most days she stood behind the counter by 6 a.m., sleeves rolled up, apron powdered with flour, waiting for the first wave of farmers and ranchers to file in, half awake and craving caffeine. That morning, the sun hadn't yet burned off the dew, the air smelled of dry earth and sun-scorched hope. Maggie's old hands moved rhythmically, pouring coffee, sliding plates, wiping counters, but her mind drifted to Sarah Miller, the woman seated quietly at the far end of the diner. Sarah was always polite, always grateful, and lately always tired. The rancher's daughter came in every few days for a cheap cup of coffee and whatever Maggie could spare, day-old muffins, an extra biscuit, nothing fancy, just enough to keep her going. Maggie never asked for payment anymore. She could tell Sarah's pride made even accepting leftovers feel like a silent negotiation. That morning, Sarah sat hunched over the counter, fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped ceramic mug. She looked like she hadn't slept. Maggie recognized that kind of exhaustion, the kind that didn't come from lack of rest, but from trying to hold the whole world together with frayed rope. Just coffee today? Maggie asked softly. Already knowing the answer, Sarah gave a tired smile. Just coffee. Maggie nodded and topped off her cup. From where Maggie stood, she could see Sarah's hand trembling slightly, probably from hunger or worry or both. What Maggie didn't know yet was that Sarah had just spread her last $2,000 across her kitchen table that morning. That was it, the last of it. The drought had turned her pasture into dust, and her horses, the last remaining piece of her father's legacy, were running out of feed. Sarah could have used that money to buy one last load of hay, maybe stretch another month, but the night before, she'd walked the property, counting fence posts and calculating losses, and deep down she already knew the land was slipping through her fingers. Maggie didn't know that part yet, but she would soon. Don't miss what happens next. The bell over the front door jingled, a sound Maggie usually welcomed, but this time it came with a different kind of silence. A quiet tension walked in with the man who sat inside. He was wearing worn jeans, a faded military ball cap, and a jacket that had seen better decades. His face was sharp, eyes sunken, a beard that hadn't been trimmed in days. He didn't say much as he limped toward the counter, not from laziness, Maggie could tell, but from an old wound that never fully healed. Coffee black. The man muttered, lowering himself onto a stool 3 seats away from Sarah, and Maggie poured without a word. She knew how to read people. This man was proud, wounded, but proud. Sarah looked up from her cup and watched him. Maggie noticed Sarah was quiet, but observant. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition. That stare, the 1,000-yard kind. Her cousin had returned from Afghanistan with that same haunted look. She knew what it meant. How's the job hunt going, Tom? Maggie asked, trying to keep it light. He gave a half-hearted shrug. Warehouse said no. My leg? Well, liability. Maggie hated how employers talk like that. Liability, as if the man hadn't already paid in full. Sarah's fingers tightened around her mug. Tom took a slow sip of coffee. We got the eviction notice yesterday. Maggie froze. Eviction? He nodded. 3 days. $22,000, or we're out. Maggie didn't have a reply for that, and she noticed, neither did Sarah. My wife's working extra at the hospital. The baby's sick though, Tom added, barely audible. We're out of options. Silence fell again, heavy, dense, the kind of silence that makes a person's ribs feel tight. Maggie thought she saw Sarah shift slightly in her seat, like something inside her was unraveling, and then came the question, you served? Sarah asked. Tom turned, surprised. He nodded once. 2 tours Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Sarah nodded. My cousin was with the 10th Mountain, said they were the toughest group over there. Tom smiled faintly. Good unit. Maggie stayed quiet. She didn't want to interrupt. Something was building, something she couldn't quite name yet. Then Sarah reached into her coat pocket. Her movements were slow, intentional. Maggie watched in disbelief as she pulled out an envelope, thick, worn at the corners, and laid it gently on the counter between them. I have $2,000, she said. Tom blinked. What? It was going to be for feed, Sarah continued. For my horses. But your family needs it more. Maggie's heart nearly stopped. Tom stared at the envelope, then back at Sarah. I can't take that. We don't even know each other. You served our country, she said simply. My dad used to say we owe veterans more than we could ever repay. Tom shook his head. But that's your money. You need it. Sarah's lips trembled. I'll figure something out. Maybe sell another horse. Maggie couldn't stay silent anymore. Sarah, are you sure about this? Sarah didn't even blink. What good is money if I just watched someone else lose everything? Tom swallowed hard, his hand hovered over the envelope before finally taking it. I don't know what to say. You don't have to, Sarah said. Just promise me you'll get back on your feet. I swear it, Tom whispered. Maggie turned away to refill the coffee pot, mostly so no one would see the tears forming in her eyes. After Tom left, Sarah stayed for another half hour, sipping slowly, silent. That was your feed money, wasn't it? Maggie asked. Sarah nodded. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, Sarah said. Call around, maybe someone has hay to spare or work. Maggie sighed. She wanted to fix it, but knew better than to offer false hope. That night, Maggie stood in the diner's back doorway, watching Sarah's truck disappear down the road. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the dry hills. Maggie had seen a lot in her years behind that counter, but something about Sarah Miller's quiet sacrifice shook her deeply. She didn't know what would come next, but something told her this wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. The next morning came with an unsettling stillness. Maggie unlocked the Bluebell Diner just before 6 o'clock, same as always, but the air felt different. The usual buzz of the early crowd was missing, no chatter about feed prices or busted tractors, just a quiet that crept under the door and settled over the counter like fog. She was wiping down the coffee machine when the memory of Sarah's face flashed through her mind, the way she had walked out the night before, shoulders slumped but eyes steady. That woman had given up everything she had left to help a stranger, and Maggie knew that kind of giving left a mark on a person, deep and irreversible. By 7, only 2 regulars had shown up. Maggie poured their coffee and tried to keep busy, but her eyes kept darting to the door, hoping maybe Sarah would walk in again, hoping she hadn't lost everything overnight. Just after 8, the phone rang. It was Roy Jansen from the feed store. Maggie, you wouldn't happen to know if Sarah Miller's in town, would you? Maggie's heart skipped, not sure why. Well, I got her on the list for a hay delivery last week, but I heard she backed out. I was going to give her a discount if she could pay today. Old man Bill left me some surplus, thought maybe you'd pass the message along if you see her. Maggie thanked him and hung up, but the knot in her chest only grew tighter. She stepped out back to get some air and looked down the road that led toward Miller Ranch. Dust hung in the distance, not much, but just enough to catch the light. She didn't know it yet, but something had happened out there, something big. Back on the ranch, Sarah Miller had woken up to the sound of horses crying out, not panicked, just hungry. It was a familiar sound now, one that twisted in her chest. She pulled on her boots, stepped out into the morning light, braced herself for what she knew had to be done. Today, she would start making calls to sell the remaining horses. She hated the thought her father's horses were more than just animals. They were his legacy, his blood, sweat, and early mornings bound into their care. But with the last of the feed nearly gone, she had no choice. Her porch creaked underfoot as she stepped down into the yard. The barn stood quiet under the rising sun. The red paint had faded, the fences leaned tiredly, and the dry pasture stretched endlessly, cracked and brittle. She whispered apologies as she scattered the last handfuls of grain, just enough to quiet their stomachs, not enough to nourish them. I'll figure something out, she murmured, stroking her father's favorite mare on the nose. I promise. But even Sarah didn't believe those words anymore. Then the sound of gravel crunching tires. She turned toward the drive, expecting maybe a neighbor or Roy from the feed store, but what she saw made her freeze mid-step. 3 large military trucks were rolling down the narrow path toward her ranch, dust clouds rising behind them like something out of a war film. Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped forward cautiously. The lead truck came to a stop and a man in full uniform stepped out, tall, composed, metals glinting softly in the sunlight. Are you Sarah Miller? He asked. Sarah nodded. Yes, what's going on? I'm Colonel Richard Beckett, he said, offering a hand. We're looking for some local land to use for training exercises. Your property was recommended to us. She blinked. My property? Yes, ma'am. We need open terrain for signal and communication testing. Quiet, isolated spots with good coverage. Yours fits. Sarah looked around her broken fence lines and dust-filled pasture, trying to understand. Who recommended me? The colonel consulted a small notepad. Hey, Mr. Tom Wilson said your land was perfect for this kind of exercise. Her breath caught. Tom from the diner. Yes, he's one of our veterans, works with our reintegration program. Now Sarah could barely process it. The man she gave her last $2,000 to, the one who said he had no job, no stability, had sent the military to her doorstep. I don't understand, she said softly. The colonel smiled gently. We're prepared to offer $5,000 for 3 days' use of your land. We'll keep to ourselves, handle everything, and won't interfere with your animals or structures. Sarah swayed slightly, her knees locking to keep from stumbling. $5,000, enough to buy feed, enough to keep the ranch running another month, maybe more. She swallowed. That would help a lot. Good, the colonel said. Would you mind showing me the property? We'd like to set up along the southern ridge. Sarah led the way, still numb. As they walked, more trucks pulled up. Men in uniform began unloading. Crates and equipment. One soldier passed her with a respectful nod, carrying what looked like long communication poles and field radios. Then a voice called out, "Colonel, we've offloaded the special delivery." The colonel nodded. "Excellent. Miss Miller, would you mind showing us your barn? If the weather shifts, we might need indoor storage." She led him to the barn, heart pounding, but when she pulled the doors open, she stopped cold. Inside, stacked neatly along the sidewall, were hay bales, dozens of them, fresh, golden, fragrant enough to feed her horses for weeks. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "What is this?" The colonel simply said, "Just part of the arrangement. We believe in leaving places better than we found them." Sarah turned to him, stunned. "But how did you know I needed feed?" The colonel smiled. "There's someone better suited to explain that." Right on cue, a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway. Sarah walked outside as the back door opened, and Tom Wilson stepped out. But he looked nothing like the weary, slumped man from the diner. He stood tall, limp nearly gone, wearing a crisp uniform. A badge she didn't recognize gleamed on his chest. "Hello, Sarah," he said with a soft smile. She folded her arms. "You look different." He nodded. "May we talk inside?" Inside the kitchen, as she made coffee again out of habit more than courtesy, she didn't speak until the mugs were full. "You weren't just a veteran in trouble, were you?" she asked. Tom shook his head. "I am a veteran, but not without resources, and yes, my family was facing eviction, but not because we had no help, because the system moved slow, too slow." Sarah stared at him. Silent. Tom slid a folder across the table. "I work with the Mercer Foundation. We assist struggling veterans, but we also watch for people like you, people who help even when it costs them everything." "You were testing me," Sarah whispered. "No," Tom replied gently, "we were observing, and you passed something. No one can fake his character." Maggie didn't usually close the diner in the middle of the day, but that afternoon, after the morning rush faded and the heat settled in like a heavy blanket, she hung the back in 30 sign on the door and locked up. Something in her chest just wouldn't sit still. She needed to see Sarah. The gravel crunched under her truck tires as she drove east, the road winding past brittle pastures and broken fences until Miller Ranch appeared in the distance, Red Barn barely holding its color, but something else too, something new. Military trucks, equipment, activity, and horses. She realized horses munching on fresh golden hay. When Maggie parked at the gate and stepped out, she didn't have time to knock. Sarah met her halfway, boots dusty, hands still stained with grain. "And Maggie," she asked, surprised, "what are you doing all the way out here?" "I was about to ask you the same thing," Maggie replied, glancing toward the trucks. "Is that the army?" "Not exactly," Sarah said, brushing her hair from her face. "Come inside, I'll explain." The house smelled like fresh coffee and sunlight, the kind of quiet warmth only someone who's lived through hard winters could appreciate. Maggie sat down at the kitchen table and Sarah, without saying anything, slid a piece of paper toward her. Maggie picked it up, skimmed, her eyes widened. $5,000, she whispered, "for just 3 days." Sarah nodded slowly. "And that's not all." She told Maggie everything about Tom. About the diner, about the envelope, about the soldiers who showed up this morning, and the hay stacked in her barn like a silent answer to a whispered prayer. "The Mercer Foundation?" Maggie asked. Sarah stood and walked to the counter, retrieving a folder Tom had left. Inside were documents, details, and letters. "They help veterans," Sarah said, "but they also look for people who help others quietly without asking for anything back." Maggie turned the folder over in her hands. "So this wasn't random?" "No," Sarah said, "it was intentional, all of it." Maggie sat back, stunned. Her mind drifted back to that moment in the diner, the look in Sarah's eyes as she slid the envelope across the counter. She had no idea anyone was watching, that her choice would ripple this far. "You know," Maggie said slowly, "I've spent my life feeding people, listening to stories, but I've never seen something like this." Sarah smiled, soft and tired. "Neither have I." But just as the weight of it all began to settle, another truck rolled up outside, not military this time, a long black SUV, polished to a shine. The two women stood and stepped onto the porch. As the door opened, a man in a dark suit stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his tie was loose, but his presence was unmistakable, calm, commanding. "Miss Miller," he said. Sarah nodded, cautious. "I'm James Mercer." Maggie blinked. "The name from the folder, the founder. I believe you've spoken with Tom," he continued. "And Colonel Beckett?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Is something wrong?" Mercer shook his head. "No, quite the opposite. I just prefer to meet the people we invest in myself." He stepped up onto the porch, looking out over the ranch, the tired barn, the patched fences, the fields slowly reclaiming life. "My father was a horseman," he said, "before we lost everything, and I used to sleep in barns like that when I was a boy." Sarah didn't know what to say. She simply nodded. "I was homeless once," Mercer continued, voice steady. "Someone helped me when I had nothing. Years later, I built the foundation to repay the debt of kindness. But here's what I've learned over the years: people who give when they're hurting, they're the ones who understand the weight of a gift." He turned to her. "And you, Sarah Miller, gave more than money. You gave dignity. You saw a struggling veteran and acted without hesitation. That's rare." Sarah's voice trembled. "I just didn't want to let someone fall through the cracks." Mercer smiled. "Exactly." Then he handed her another envelope. "What's This? Sarah asked. A contract, Mercer replied. We're proposing something bigger than a 3-day rental. The foundation is launching a pilot program for therapeutic equine therapy for veterans recovering from PTSD, physical trauma, emotional wounds, and your ranch. It's exactly what we've been looking for. Sarah looked down at the envelope in her hands. It felt heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. You want to lease my land? She asked. Mercer nodded. 10 acres, we'll build the facilities, provide licensed therapists, bring in veterans from across the state. All you'd need to do is care for the horses and help guide the sessions if you're willing. Maggie watched as Sarah opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the figures. Monthly compensation for land, wages for her time and expertise, enough to cover everything she'd lost and then some. She looked up, stunned. This is a beginning, Mercer said. Silence hung between them, not uncomfortable, but holy, like something too big for words had just happened. Maggie found herself blinking back tears again. She had watched Sarah give quietly, freely, and now she was watching her be restored, not with charity, but with purpose. After Mercer left, Sarah sat on the porch steps, hands still gripping the contract. Maggie joined her. You're not just getting help, Maggie said, you're building something new. Sarah nodded slowly. I think this is what the ranch was always meant for. Maggie smiled. And your dad? He'd be real proud right now. The sun dipped low, casting golden light over the fields. In the distance, soldiers moved quietly, setting up camp. Horses nickered, fed in content, and for the first time in years, Sarah's land felt alive again. Hope had returned, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with quiet boots on gravel and a promise kept. It had been 3 days since the soldiers arrived, 3 days since Sarah Miller's quiet ranch turned into something resembling a small, orderly base of operations. But even amid the tents, trucks, and drills, the land hadn't lost its peace. If anything, the military presence seemed to breathe new life into the place. Maggie came by again on the third morning, bringing a box of still warm cinnamon rolls. She found Sarah standing near the barn, watching one of the soldiers gently stroke the muzzle of her father's old mare. You're feeding them sugar, aren't you? Sarah asked with a smirk. The young man laughed. Ma'am, I plead the fifth. Maggie stepped beside her, holding out the box. Peace offering. Sarah took one, chuckling. I could eat 6. But I'll start with one. The 2 women sat under the shade of the oak tree near the paddock, watching the soldiers work. Some were repairing the back fence, others were clearing brush along the creek line, a few were adjusting communication poles, the so-called training exercise that had brought them here in the first place. You realize they've fixed more of your ranch in 3 days than a year's worth of hired hands? Maggie said. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. I know. And they refused to let me pay for any of it. It's not charity, Maggie reminded her, it's gratitude. Sarah looked down at her hands, still rough from work, still marked by years of strain. It doesn't feel real. A week ago, I was rationing hay and wondering how many horses I'd have to sell just to keep the lights on. Now, I'm being offered a lease, a salary, a purpose. Maggie placed a hand over hers. You were seen, Sarah, that's all any of us want in the end, to be seen, especially when we do the right thing. A voice called out from the barn. It was Tom. He was walking toward them with a different kind of stride now, not quite a limp, but not fully healed either. He carried himself with quiet confidence, and Maggie noticed how the younger soldiers deferred to him even when the colonel wasn't around. Morning, he greeted. Morning, Sarah and Maggie, they said in unison. Tom knelt down in the grass, setting a small envelope between them. What's this? Sarah asked. My promise, he said. I told you I'd pay you back. Sarah frowned. Tom, I told you I know what you told me, he interrupted gently, and I meant what I said, but the foundation insists we honor commitments. It's part of the program. She hesitated, then slowly took the envelope, but before she could speak, Tom added, or if you'd prefer, donate it. There's a veterans shelter in San Antonio just opened, they could use the funds. Sarah smiled. That feels right. Maggie watched them. It was a small exchange, but it carried weight, quiet dignity on both sides, the kind of moment people overlook unless they know what to look for. That afternoon, Colonel Beckett asked Sarah for a short walk across the south pasture, the area proposed for the therapy facility. Maggie tagged along, curious. The colonel explained the plans in more detail: modular buildings with climate control, indoor riding arena, quiet sleeping quarters for veterans staying overnight, licensed therapists, caseworkers, and horse trainers, all funded through Mercer's foundation. We've tested this in Colorado, he said, but Texas is different. The land's older here, the quiet goes deeper. Veterans feel that. Sarah nodded. So do the horses. Maggie could see it in Sarah's face. She wasn't just agreeing out of politeness, she believed it, felt it in her bones. What would you need from me? Sarah asked. Your care for the animals, your presence with the veterans, and your honesty when things don't work. We're not looking for perfect, we're looking for real. He looked out across the land. You'll build all this, she asked. The colonel nodded. And maintain it for at least 5 years with your consent. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She walked a few steps ahead, bent down, and picked up a smooth stone from the ground, turned it over in her hand. Maggie watched her closely, knowing the weight of the decision wasn't about the logistics, it was about her father, about what he built, about whether this new chapter honored the old one. Finally, Sarah turned back. "My dad used to say, this land had a purpose," she said, "but for a long time, I thought that purpose died with him. Now I see it didn't die, it just hadn't found the right moment." Colonel Beckett smiled. "We'd be honored to help you fulfill it." They returned to the house in silence, and when Sarah signed the lease later that evening, it didn't feel like a business deal, it felt like the beginning of something sacred. That night, Maggie sat with her again on the porch, listening to the sound of laughter from the distant tents, the shuffle of hooves in the barn and the wind slipping through the trees like a quiet song. "You know," Maggie said softly, "some people wait their whole lives for a sign. You didn't wait, you acted." Sarah didn't say anything, she just reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the original envelope. The one she had given Tom at the diner, now empty, now symbolic. "I was terrified," she whispered. "I thought giving it away would mean the end." Maggie looked at her with tearful eyes. "Turns out it was the beginning." The official ceremony wasn't grand, no cameras, no press, just folding chairs under a Texas sky, a few banners hanging between the fence posts and a podium borrowed from the local high school. But to Maggie Harper, it might as well have been a national holiday. The flags fluttered above the pasture where the new equine therapy center would be built, a place where veterans could find peace, not through medication or noise, but through the quiet trust of an animal, through breath, through earth, through stillness. Maggie stood at the back of the small crowd, eyes fixed on Sarah Miller. Sarah wasn't wearing anything fancy, jeans, a clean button-up, her father's old belt buckle, but she stood taller than Maggie had ever seen her, not just in posture, in spirit. She had become something more than a rancher now, she was a steward. The ceremony began with a few brief words from Colonel Beckett. He spoke plainly, like a soldier used to calling orders, but humbled by moments like these. "This program isn't about fixing people," he said, "it's about creating space for healing, and that space doesn't exist without people like Sarah Miller." Applause followed, short, respectful, warm. Tom stepped up next. He wasn't in uniform, just a gray collared shirt and jeans, but Maggie noticed several veterans in the audience stand a little straighter when he approached the mic. "I told Sarah once that I'd pay her back," he began, smiling softly, "but the truth is I never could. Not really, because what she gave me, gave all of us, was more than money." He paused, voice cracking slightly. "She gave dignity when no one else was watching." Sarah didn't cry, not visibly, but Maggie saw the way her fingers tightened around the paper. She held a short speech she hadn't yet decided if she'd read then. After a brief nod from Mercer, standing quietly near the back in a black suit and no fanfare, Sarah stepped up to the microphone. She didn't read the speech, she looked out at the crowd, then at the land behind them. "This place was built by my father," she began, "and for years after he passed, I didn't know what I was supposed to do with him. I kept feeding the horses, fixing what I could, but it always felt like I was waiting for something." Her voice didn't shake, it was calm, like rain hitting dry soil. "That I met someone at a diner, a stranger, and I had $2,000 in my pocket that I was saving for feed. I don't know why, but I gave it away." A soft murmur passed through the audience. "I thought I was losing everything that day. Turns out I was planting something." She looked over her shoulder at the red barn, the new posts lining the south pasture. "And now this ranch has a new purpose, one my father would have believed in." She stepped down without flourish. No applause broke out, not right away, because no one wanted to interrupt the quiet beauty of what she had just said, but eventually the crowd stood and the applause came, not like thunder, but like a rising tide. After the ceremony, Maggie stayed behind to help pack up chairs. Most guests had already left, but she lingered in the barn a while longer, watching Sarah walk the pasture with Tom and the Colonel, pointing at sections of fence and discussing timelines. "Funny, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. She turned, it was Mercer. "Funny how?" she asked. He gestured toward Sarah. "How sometimes the people with the least to give the most." Maggie smiled. "It's not funny to me, it's familiar." Mercer tilted his head. "Curious, I've watched people come into my diner for 2 decades, and I'll tell you, I know when someone's hurting, but chooses to be kind anyway. That's the rarest kind of courage." He nodded. "Then I hope you know this never would have happened without you." Maggie blinked. "Me? You kept the doors open, you kept her fed, you saw her when others didn't. That matters more than you know." He handed her a card. "If you ever want to be part of the foundation in any way, advisory, volunteer, we'd be lucky to have you." Maggie tucked the card into her apron without looking at it. "Let's just make sure those horses stay fed first." They both laughed. That evening, Sarah and Maggie sat on the porch again, just like they had so many times before, but this time, the air felt different. Lighter. The contract was signed, the funds were processed. Construction would begin within a week. The horses had full bellies, the ranch had a future, and Sarah had peace. "You ever think," Sarah said quietly, "that maybe giving away your last dollar is exactly when life gives you something back?" Maggie nodded. "Yeah, but only if you do it for the right reasons." They watched the sun dip below the horizon. No grand music, no big finale, just 2 women watching a piece of the world finally settle into place. And in the distance by the barn, one of the Maras let out a soft whinny as if she too understood hope had returned. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, And in the hands of those who had the heart to give, even when they had nothing left. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.